Father, as we enter into a subject tonight that is very difficult for the Western mind to even begin to comprehend, much less understand, I pray that you would anoint our minds and open us up and have us to receive what you would have us to. And help us to have an understanding of this so that we might, on one hand, be able to minister to those that are caught up in this tremendously satanic philosophy, and also that we might have that deeper appreciation of our precious salvation that was wrought by your Son. So we dedicate the next couple hours to you. Pray that your Spirit would teach us and that He would just move in a mighty way. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, tonight we're going to be talking about Eastern philosophies and religions. But before we get into that, we have what is entitled A Short Quiz on Egypt to Rome. And so if you would like to go ahead and begin, you can put your name on it. And I might mention, those of you that took the short quiz last week, not everybody turned them in. So you will have a 0 if you don't. And also on your homework from the first week, that homework assignment about traducianism and trichotomy and dichotomy and all of that, you can still turn that in, but it will count against your final grade if you don't. So go ahead and just take the test. Shouldn't take you just a couple of seconds, and then when you're done, turn the sheets over so I can know everybody's done. As soon as you finish, turn them over. Anybody not done? Okay, let's turn your tests over and we'll begin. If you get any of them wrong, of course they're just true and false, so if you get them wrong you know what the other answer is. But you want to be able to look at your test later and be able to tell, well, did I check that wrong and then correct it or whatever. So, you know, because you'll need to use these to study from, so you'll have to know what the correct answer is if you miss any of them. Number 1. The word hieroglyphics means difficult to understand. True or false? False. What's it mean? Priestly carvings, right. There are more than 500 gods listed in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. True or false?
False.
True. True. More than 500 gods. About 1,200 altogether, but the Book of the Dead, which lists the major ones, there's more than 500. What did you think the answer was, Maurice?
Well, last week I thought you said there was 500 in the Book of the Dead. There's 1,200 in all, but 500 in the book. That's what I thought. So there's not more in the book.
Well, maybe there's 501.
Or there's more books of the dead than one?
No. There's more than 500 gods that are listed in the Book of the Dead. And a total of maybe 1,200. Okay, number 3. The priests gained their power by being able to predict seasonal cycles. True or false? True. Remember the first main thing that they did was the star Sirius would rise right at dawn just a few days before the flooding of the Nile, and so they were able to predict that seasonal flooding. Osiris is identified with the Babylonian god Dagon. True or false? You're all afraid to jump onto that. False.
Was it Nimrod?
Well, Dagon wasn't a Babylonian god. He was a Canaanite god. And he wasn't identified with Osiris. Osiris was identified with Bacchus, or as far as the Babylonian gods, it would be Anu, or the historical figure of Ninus or Nimrod. So if you were thinking any of those things, it was correct, but not Dagon. Okay, Egyptian religion is very simple and non-contradictory. True or false? False. All right, you all should have got that one. Number 6, the Sophists were the first to develop humanism as a school of thought. True or false? True. They were the first to develop. Now, there have been humanistic acts ever since the Garden of Eden, but as a school of thought, they were the first to develop humanism. Kronos attempted to foil the prophecy concerning him by eating his herds of cattle. True or false?
False.
Okay, what did he do? He ate his kids, right. The mystery cults usually centered on the deities of vegetation. True or false?
False.
True.
True.
True. That was, the whole thing with why they turned into such drunken orgies is because of the annual harvest, and they would, as they harvested the hops or the grain or whatever, and that would be used to make the alcohol, and because of the mystery cults were centered on that vegetation, it was the whole life and death cycle of the seasons. And that was where the Nimrod and Semiramis worship and all of that just sprung up into just every different culture that we've looked at so far. They all had their mystery cults, and that's usually what they were centered around. Okay, number 9. The Greco-Roman gods were generally in the form of animals. True or false? False. No, that was the Egyptians that had animal heads with human bodies, but the Greeks, because they were so humanistic in their approach, they just made gods immortal men. That's basically all they were just immortal men. The only difference between them and the gods were the gods lived forever. In fact, in most cases, were inferior to men as far as their mentality and their common sense and things like that goes, or in a lot of cases. Okay, number 10. Dionysus and Bacchus are the same god. True or false? True. Dionysus is the Greek name and Bacchus was the Roman name. Okay, 10 points for each one, and we'll pass them in at the break. And I do need to collect them because I'll be recording the grades. Okay, if you'll open or turn to your outlines, we'll begin. Tonight we're going to talk about some various types and aspects of Eastern philosophy, specifically Hinduism, Buddhism. I included Islam in this, although it doesn't fit with the general mode what we would think of with Eastern philosophy. It is one of the Eastern religions. And last one is Taoism, which may or may not be one that you're familiar with. But even if we're not familiar with it as a specific philosophy of religion, when we go into the tenets of Taoism, you'll see how encrusted it is in Western thought. So let's begin with Hinduism. First of all, when we talk about Hinduism, a lot of people have this idea of Hinduism as being an organization that has a set of a statement of faith with certain tenets that box it in, and this is Hinduism. But as you begin to study it, you'll find out that not only is that not true as far as present Hinduism goes, but when you look at the whole history of Hinduism, it's gone through some very radical changes from the beginning to the present. And so first of all, I'd like to real briefly just take a look at the stages of development, or the historical development of Hinduism. First of all, there's what's known as Vedic Hinduism. And this is also called the pre-Aryan or Dravidic Hinduism. And this is the religion of the Indian people before the Aryan invasion. When the Aryan people settled a long time ago, about this, just around the same time as Nimrod, when they were settling, shortly afterwards anyway, when they were settling into the Indus River Valley, it was already populated by some people of unknown origin, and they had a very primitive form of Hinduism that they were already practicing that developed into what we normally think of as Hinduism. This particular form didn't go much into life after death. And so what we think of with the preoccupation with reincarnation and that sort of thing really wasn't much to play in this very early form. They were into, it was animistic as far as worshiping, different animate objects of nature, and it had a very large pantheon. But it was more of it was kind of similar to some of the other idol systems where you were dependent upon the god of rain during the rainy season, you were dependent upon the god of sunshine when it was time to dry things out, and this sort of thing. So it was just kind of a simple form of idolatry. Then later came what's known as the Brahmanic Hinduism, which is where, as the Aryan people, the Indo-Europeans, as they settled into the Indus Valley and brought with them some of the things that they brought from the Tigris and Euphrates area, what we know as Hinduism, or at least the concept that most people have of Hinduism, began to take its form during this period. They were very much into magic and ceremonialism, though. They were into incantations and this sort of thing, in that the gods that were being worshipped before still existed, but they lost their power as contrasted to the ceremonialism or the ritualism and the incantations of the magic spells and stuff. That's where the power was, rather than in the gods themselves. This was also the time that the doctrine of karma and reincarnation had its birth. Its beginnings were in this period. It was also the beginning of the caste system that we'll talk more about later. And we're talking, I'm just real roughly guessing, around 3,000 BC. That's just a rough figure. 2,000 or 3,000 BC is the time period. The exact dates, they don't know when the actual Indo-European invasion of the Indus Valley was, but this is just kind of for a rough time frame. Okay, then it developed into what we commonly think of when we see the guy with the gray hair sitting up on top of the mountaintop thinking about his belly button. It developed into that type of philosophy during the philosophic period, and what we would think of as the philosophic Hinduism. This is when the group of writings known as the Upanishads, I'll write them on the board. You'll run into this quite a bit in your, if you're ever reading about Hinduism, Upanishads. These are several volumes that were written during this time period, and basically they are just writings about philosophy, Hinduistic philosophy. They had a monistic worldview, which is basically different than what Hinduism today is. Now, when we talk about monism or a monistic view, it's contrasted somewhat from pantheism. Who can give me a definition of pantheism? Anybody? Liz?
I could try. Is that where God created and then left?
No.
The world going?
No. Doug?
Everything is God.
Okay, everything is God. That's pantheism. Monism is similar, but a more precise definition of it is everything is one. Okay, it's an extremely natural worldview. Okay, monism is everything is one, pantheism is everything is God. Yes, Sherry?
Pantheism doesn't fall into this time.
No, this is what monism, now Hinduism today is a very pantheistic view. But monism was the primary view during this philosophic period. It was, and again, you know, like I said in the prayer, this is a very, when we talk about Eastern philosophy, we're talking about a very abstract thing. And it's hard for Western mind to comprehend some of these things. And so when we say it had a monistic view, you know, a lot of the things that I'll be teaching tonight, I don't understand. I mean, there are things that I've learned in a book, but I don't understand them because they just make no sense. And I don't see how people can comprehend complete nothingness. You know, to me, that's zip. But to them, that's everything. Well, their idea of this philosophy in that time period was they had a monistic worldview as far as their approach, but the end result was a very pantheistic view. And I don't really understand that conclusion, but their conclusion was pantheism, but their approach was monistic. And I can't really explain it any more than that. Okay, then developed what is known as the devotional or sectarian Hinduism. This is also very ancient. We're still talking several thousand years ago when these sort of things, and there was kind of a parallel in the developments. They were kind of like some branches of the same trunk. But this is where Hare Krishna, you know, Krishna worship, Vishnu, who we'll talk about in a little bit, is their main deity. And Vishnu, he is one of their main deities, and he has several avatars, which just simply means an incarnation. Okay, a physical representation of Vishnu is an avatar, and this is done primarily in the form of Krishna and Rama. You might have heard, you know, that when Gandhi was shot, his last words were "O Rama." That was his avatar of Vishnu, his incarnation of Vishnu. It's interesting that some of the very early depictions of Krishna as an incarnation of Vishnu was him holding a serpent by the tail and crushing his head with his heel. And that's interesting. And remember, you know, as we talked about this, how in the beginning, you know, faith in God was pure, and then it became tainted, and it just kind of branched out from there. There were still these remnants of, you know, and this, I mean, that prophecy was made before, and all of the descendants of Adam and Eve had a remnant of remembrance of that type of prophecy. And so as it became tainted and perverted, some of the truth of the original prophecy still stayed in there. Vishnu is also the equivalent to the Hindu Savior. Of course, their idea of salvation is totally different than ours, but he is their their mediator. But when you use terms like salvation and mediation and things like that, it's totally removed from Christianity. You know, their whole concept of sin is different than ours, because they don't have a, you know, to us, sin is when we violate the personal holy God. Well, they don't have a personal holy God. So their whole idea of sin is simply building up bad karma. And so their idea of salvation or reconciliation is the steps to undo that bad karma. And we'll get into more of that in a little bit. Okay, and then recently, and we'll say recently, like in the last 600-700 years up to present, there has been various forms of Reformed Hinduism. A lot of this had to do with the fact that Muslim and Christian influences came into India and began to meld with some of the ancient practices of devotional or philosophic Hinduism. And you can see that in the teachings of Gandhi and some of the others. But then also there are branches of Reformed Hinduism that are trying to go back to the early things of the Vedic Hinduism and the Brahmanic Hinduism, where it's a true Reformed Hinduism, you know, where they trying to a restored Hinduism. And so there's all kinds of these type of things. In fact, one guy I was reading said that you could even put Buddhism and Jainism, which is a similar, we won't really go into Jainism, but it was contemporary to Buddha, the philosophy, about the same time, about the 6th century BC, where Buddha took a secular view to his philosophy. Jainism was practically the same thing, only it was a spiritual view. It's got a little more religion in it than what Buddhism does. But these could be viewed as Reformed Hinduistic philosophies. Charles Braden, who was a professor of religion at a Northeast University about a generation ago, made the statement, "It is broad, it is tolerant, it has an absorptive quality that enables it to assimilate almost anything with which it comes in contact. And when it was officially asked for census purposes, what constitutes a Hindu, the only answer that one writer could find as satisfactory was this: anyone who says he is a Hindu is one." There is no consensus on Hinduism. There is no definitive work that says this is what Hinduism is. In fact, I could even go beyond this statement, because I have a relative who is into as much of what we're going to look at tonight as anybody I've ever known before. And when I was talking to her a few months ago, I says, "You must be a Hindu." And she goes, "I am." I mean, to her, the label didn't matter, but she believed all the things that a Hindu does. So I think it could go beyond the fact that anyone who claims that is a Hindu is. There are a lot of Hindus who don't even know that's what they are. C.S. Lewis even went so far as to say, you know, we've been saying all along there are two religions, God reaching down to man and then man reaching back to God. Well, C.S. Lewis went so far as to say that man reaching back to God is Hinduism, and everything falls in some way or another within this category. And as we go through this tonight, maybe you'll be able to see that. There is one unifying factor in all of these things that we've talked about. As diverse as the various philosophies are, I mean, there are, you know, today you've got as much you've got the Maharishi Yogi, and you got the guy they just kicked out of Oregon. There's a guy back east, a guru back east, and his big thing is sex. And it's a whole Hinduistic approach to sex, and that's how they arrive at nirvana. You know, and again, the yuppie cult from the West Coast, the Tibetan monks, and all this sort of thing. There's one unifying factor that holds it all together. And just a side note to me, you know, as I have dealt with people in the past from Eastern philosophies somewhat, and it seems like the one complaint that they've all got about Christianity is that there are so many religions. You know, which religion of Christianity are you? You know, is one of the questions that they'll ask. But I mean, there's more in common between the snake handlers in Tennessee and the Vatican than there is between some of these philosophies of Hinduism. And there are so many sects and so many diverse ways of looking at it. So, but there is one unifying factor, and that is their literature, which is basically in three parts. You got the Upanishads, which I mentioned. These are the books of philosophy. You've got the Vedas, V-E-D-A-S, which are the hymns. And maybe you might be reading in a book and it'll say something about the Vedic hymn. Well, that's what it's referring to, are these Vedas, which are vast numbers of works that are songs, hymns, that tell the stories of these ancient Hindu gods, which there are millions of them in Hindu pantheon. And then, thirdly, you've got the Bhagavad Gita, which is the Hindu Bible. And the Krishnas? Actually, no, it's not. It's one of the Upanishads, I believe. I've seen that book before, and I'm thinking that's what it was. Butch used to have a Bhagavad Gita that he threw away. He asked me if I wanted to have it for this course, and I told him no, and I wish I'd have kept it now. But I think that's one of the Upanishads, the teachings of the philosophy of Krishna. But it might be one of the Vedas too, because it's one that tells the stories of some of the escapades of Krishna. Okay, transmigration of souls. Now there are basically two things that you need to have some kind of understanding on before you can even begin to understand Hinduism. And one is this doctrine of reincarnation or transmigration of souls, and the other is karma. And we'll talk about both of them specifically. Hinduism, at least as an Eastern philosophy, believes in the doctrine of transmigration of souls. Now this is different than reincarnation, in that transmigration of souls teaches that all living beings are eternal. I mean, they've existed forever, and in this life, birth, or life, death, and rebirth cycle that is continuous, you can become reborn in many forms of animate objects. You might be a man one time and come back as a lily pad the next, or you could come back as a bee or a dog or a horse or anything like that. That's why this supreme veneration of animal life in India. That's why they've got 180 million cows that they won't eat, because they're afraid they'd be eating their grandmother. That's why what grain they have is kept for the cows, and when the rats get in to eat the grain, they don't do anything to the rats, because that could be your uncle. And this is transmigration of souls. Reincarnation, on the other hand, is more of a Western view that has come across, and we'll be looking at that more next week when we talk about the New Age movement. But reincarnation is the idea that living human souls always come back as living human souls. You know, the Western mind can't hang with the idea that I'd come back as a grasshopper or a lily pad. But it's more palatable to the Western thought of the fact that I could come back. You know, I could be Napoleon in one of my lives and then come back as George Washington in the next, or what, you know, always come back as a famous person. I mean, everybody's always a reincarnation of somebody famous. Either that or you were the servant of somebody famous.
Did reincarnation originate from Hinduism, or was that just...
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
Okay, so they had... So how does reincarnation... do they believe in transmigration of souls or reincarnation?
Who's they?
Well, I realize that Hinduism is pretty broad, but...
Which one do Hindus believe?
Yeah.
It depends on who you're talking about. Yeah, it's very broad. Most of the Indian Hindus, and when you talk about Eastern religions, and even into like China and Japan and Korea, most of their views is that of transmigration of souls.
I guess I'm wondering if reincarnation is just a convenience for Westerners. They don't feel comfortable with coming back as a...
For me to say yes would be making it too simplistic, but by and large that is the truth. But then when you look at reincarnation, you know, you've got so many diverse views of reincarnation. Like you have some people who oh gosh, just the whole view of reincarnation. You got some guys who teach that there is never an end to this whole thing. There are some who teach that you have to, because of this whole thing about, well, if you're going to work off your own bad karma, then it has to be you that comes back. And so it is actually you who is, you know, you don't, I mean, you're not Napoleon's servant in one life and then come back as a dance hall girl in 1880 San Francisco the next life, and that, you know, you always got to come back as you each time. And then there's other guys who say, yeah, you even have to be in the same family line. And then on up into some of the Christian reincarnationists who teach that, well, if you don't accept Christ, you know, since Christ died for all sins, they're just a universal salvation thing. So, you know, when you die, either you go to heaven or you get reborn and you have another chance, or then they got the guys that are trying to answer the question, well, what about the pygmies down in Lower Slobovia and these sort of things that never heard, you know, what about them? Well, they just get reborn again as somebody else, and then they, you know, everybody at some point in their life always has another chance. And so there are so many views to reincarnation, but most, I would say 90% of all reincarnation as I've defined it is Western. Now, when I use the term reincarnation, though, I use it very generically. So if I might even be referring to the Indian view and just use that word. Okay. Liz was next.
Well, I'm kind of confused about the difference between transmigration of soul and reincarnation.
Okay, reincarnation says you can only be reborn as a human, dies, and is reborn as a human. Okay. Transmigration of soul says that all living beings, whether you're a flower, a snake, a cactus, whatever, a human being, whatever, they're all living, they all have a soul. And this is, you know, kind of going into that true pantheism sort of thing. And they all have a living soul. And so, depending upon whatever your karma that you have to work out, that determines what you are reborn as. Okay, Maurice?
So when they take a look at us and they say, what religion are you in Christianity, they're not looking at themselves as what type of Hindu are you? You know, the variance in...
Yeah, well, see, because Hinduism is so inclusive, and because it is so ecumenical, they don't really look at themselves as being, you know, because they can look at Baptists and Methodists fighting all day long. Well, Hindu won't do that. A Hindu will say, God is love. And that's the end of the matter. You know, they won't talk beyond that. And so they don't really look at themselves as being sectarian in the same way that Christian denominations are. Although that's not necessarily true. I mean, Gandhi was the victim of a sectarian struggle. And so, you know, what happened here a couple years ago with Indira's son. And so, you know, that, I mean, it's not necessarily true, but that's the way they look at it. And they see what goes on in Ireland, and they say, yeah, and they call that, you know, they call themselves Christians, sort of thing. Deb?
The reincarnation view, doesn't that kind of, the number of souls are limited. How do they deal with increasing population, do you know?
There are several problems with reincarnation. That's one of them. His question is, okay, if there are only so many souls, then how come there are 4.5 billion people on the earth today where there was only 2 billion people 100 years ago, and so on? How come you keep getting more and more people? If souls were eternal, there's only a set number of souls. How come you keep getting more? They do have some explanations that are very weak and very lengthy to explain, but that's one of the criticisms to it. Another one would be if souls are eternal and a person is only working out his karma, in other words, something that I did in a past life causes me to have to be reincarnated because of evil I did in a past life, I have to work that karma out in the next life, then at some point you've got to have that pure state. You've got to have, you've got to have the very first life. In other words, okay, why did that life have trouble? Where was the karma that he was working out? At some point, you got to have a beginning point, and they don't have an answer to that. So there are many holes in just the very concept of reincarnation has a lot of weaknesses in it. Okay, we got to move on. Okay, so that's reincarnation now, and transmigration of souls. There are basically two foundations to that. First is pantheism and monism, which I've explained. And that is that all is one or all is God, depending upon whether you have looking at it from a Buddhism is kind of a monistic approach, where most Hinduism is a pantheistic approach, looking at it from a very spiritual, I'm going to get into God type of thing. where monism is just strictly looking at it from a human point of view. And then secondly is the idea of karma. Now remember last week when we talked about the Greeks and the Romans, we saw that they had a view of fatalism, which basically is the idea that the fates, these three sisters, the fate sisters, they determined what would come down in everybody's life. Right? And there was nothing that you could do about it short of outsmarting them. There was nothing you, I mean, if you were going to be struck by lightning on a certain day, it doesn't matter if you stay in a cave. You know, all that day, the lightning's going to get in there somehow and it's going to strike you, if that was in the fates. That's different. It's almost the opposite of what karma is. Karma says that you have a debt that needs to be worked out, and that the things that happen to you aren't a result of the fate that has been predetermined, but just this karma, this law of karma, the debt that you owe as a result of prior actions. And since they couldn't explain why babies were born dead when they didn't have any prior actions, they had to come up with that, well, it had to have been a previous life. And so this is where this whole idea of karma came from. Sherry?
Where did we come from in the first place?
Basically, it's similar. She asked, where do we come from in the first place? Basically, it's similar to any secular, and I use the word secular as opposed to Christian view, in that the universe, if you're looking at it from a monistic point of view, you're just talking about the rocks and the gases and everything else. If you're looking at it from a pantheistic point of view, you're talking about the force, you know, just the life of the universe is eternal. God is eternal. And we are all, everything in the universe is God, so we are all eternal. That's where it all came from. It existed. In fact, let's go ahead and move on. This next statement will explain it. Another thing on karma before we go on, though. Karma is cause and effect. Okay, it's just the Bible talks about reaping and sowing. Well, that's what karma is. If you drink, that's your cause, and the effect is you get a hangover. Okay, well, expand that times a million, and that's karma. Anything that happens to us is a result of something that we did in the past. The thing that happened to us is the effect, and whatever we did in the past, whether it was this life or the next previous life, was the cause. So that's basically karma, very simply stated. Now, the Hindu Godhead, they have yeah, Doug. Yes. But primarily, the whole, this road to nirvana that all of these things are going to, whether it's, you know, your complete nothingness or just being absorbed into the cosmic wow, all of this is an attempt to not pile up good karma as much as it is to undo the bad karma. That's the primary goal. But good works are a way to do that, and especially when we get into the monism of Buddhism. Okay, the Hindu Godhead. Now they do have a type of Trinity. You got Brahman or that. You see that in capital letters. Okay, this is the Tetragrammaton of Hinduism. Initially, and we're talking, you know, like back in the Vedic Hinduistic days, they had this supreme god of Brahma. Now you see on your notes it's Brahman with an N on the end, but originally it was Brahma, and he was the one God, he was personal, and he was love. Okay? In the process of time, he became very impersonalized, and in fact it's said that there's only one temple in all of India to him. And he became very impersonalized, and he received a neuter noun name. In other words, it's neither he nor she, it's it, and that's a Brahman. And so he is known by his Tetragrammaton, the very impersonal name of that. Which means, you know, like when we talk about Yahweh, he is that he is the self-existing one. Well, that means the same thing, only impersonal. Is just a simple way of putting it. Vishnu, we talked a little bit about him earlier, and his avatars being Krishna and Rama. And then thirdly, Shiva. Now we could look at Krishna. Now Shiva is the destroyer and the restorer. And so we could look at Krishna and we could say, well, he's the Hindu equivalent of Christ, and then we could look at Shiva and say he's the Hindu equivalent of Satan. And it's not that quite cut and dried. In fact, there are aspects of Vishnu and aspects of Shiva that both make them counterparts of Christ in a certain way, as him being, you know, that prophecy, but way back in Genesis 3. The whole thing about Christ being, you know, the restorer and the destroyer. I mean, when he comes back, you know, in Revelation, he's not pictured as having these little lambs in his sheep. He's got, you know, eyes like a flame of fire, and his hair is white. He's got a two-edged sword coming out of his mouth, and all this. So he's pictured as a very bad dude. Well, this would be kind of the side that's known in Shiva. Only he's looked at in a very, you know, grotesque way. And his consort is known as, her name is Kali, K-A-L-I, and this is Shiva's wife. And in the Vedic hymns concerning her, they sing about the fact that she nursed Shiva at her breast. And where does that sound familiar? Where have we talked about that before? We talked about that with Isis and Osiris. We talked about that with Cybele and Dionysus. And we talked about that with Tammuz and Astarte. And we talked about that with Ninus and Ishtar. So every one of these ancient systems have some place where their female deity becomes the mother of her husband. And this is the case with Kali and Shiva. She is viewed as a very, very horrible being. She has a belt she has a necklace of human heads and a girdle of human arms. You know, she is the goddess of destruction. And of course, Shiva being the god of destruction. Okay, it's interesting that these three guys, Brahman, Vishnu, and Shiva, are depicted in the very ancient statues as having one body and three heads. And usually with the inscription, the Sanskrit inscription, Eko Diva Trimurti, which means three heads, one God. Eko Diva Trimurti. Okay, they view life as a school. Life is a school, and the object of going to that school is twofold. One is to get to know Brahman. Remember that? To get to know him, or it, and what we call, or what they call, the Atman. And that's not reggae. The Atman, or as it's sometimes called, the Brahman Atman, because that's their goal, is to get to know these two things. This is the supreme deity, and this is the individual soul. These two together, once you get to know the Brahman Atman, it equals moksha, which is Hindu for salvation. Okay, so that is their goal, is to, once you fully understand, which, you know, I understand nothing of, thank goodness, but once you fully understand this, then that's where you're at. You have a ribbon. Yes?
I think the
reincarnated enough times and you've worked off your karma, karma, where do you go from then? What is salvation to them?
Well, that's what. Okay, that depends on what school of Hinduism you adhere to. The general way to put it would be to say that you are absorbed into the cosmic wow. You know, you become one with Brahman, which is all things. You know, and so you're in heaven. You know, but it's not a place. There's no streets of gold. You rise above all of that.
Not an individual soul?
Your individual soul is absorbed with all the other individual souls that have arisen before you. Didn't you see that Star Trek show?
No individual.
Oh, okay. Well, again, that depends on the school. Some say that there are none to begin with. There's no such thing as individual souls. Buddhism's one of them. And they've got a term for that. But it just depends on where you're from. Okay, the caste system. There are basically 4 castes in modern Hinduism. There used to be 5, and Gandhi took care of that. And here you see them, the intellectual priests. Now these are the guys who believe that they have been through this cycle enough times to where they've got it all pretty well down pat. And so they are the very upper crust, the gurus, the shamans, and so on. These are the guys that have worked out the majority, if not all, of their karma. And they are the most privileged. Then you've got the noble class and the warriors. You know, especially in the older days, they didn't want just a regular person to go fight the battles for you because they weren't qualified. So only the upper crust were the ones that fought the battles. And this is the 2nd grade, or primarily this is the number 1 grade because the priest class is so small. And then 3rd, you've got the administrative class, which would just be people of means, not your upper class, but this would be your landowners, people that had a hunk of dirt that they could call their own, merchants, and this sort of thing. People that got by on their own. They weren't owned, or they didn't depend upon their existence by somebody that they were subservient to. And then 4thly, you have everybody else, the masses. And this is the low class now. It used to be there was a 5th class known as the outcasts or the untouchables. They were called the untouchables, and this was the scum. I mean, these were the people that were born with no hands or this sort of thing. These were the very, very low, these were the beggars that you see on the street corners and everything. Well, now they're considered part of the masses. They used to be called the untouchables, and that's what they did. They were untouched. The rest of society had nothing to do with them because they deserved to be where they were at because it was their karma that put them there. But Gandhi and his reforms back in the first half of this century outlawed the untouchable class. Okay, so as much as is possible to put in a nutshell what Hinduism is. Basically, you see on your outline it says the wants of man. Basically, Hinduism says that if you want it, you can have it. It's okay. If you want it, you can get it. Now, that's not what I have always pictured Hinduism as being. I've always pictured Hinduism as being this skinny guy with a little loincloth wrapped around him, laying on a bed of nails, eating glass, trying to shove a sword down his throat. I've always thought that's what Hinduism was. But the true essence of Hinduism says that if there's something you desire in life, you got to go for it. You owe it to yourself, to your own self be true sort of thing. And so they have this broke down into 2 different paths. Each path has 2 different branches. You got the path of desire and the path of renunciation. Now, the path of desire, the first 2 is pleasure and success. The route of pleasure says that if there's something you want to do, if you want to go get high, go get high. That's what you ought to do. If you want to do it, you ought to do it. You ought to feed your flesh. The only limitation they have is don't do it at the expense of others. Of course, we know that it's hard. You cannot feed your flesh without it being at the expense of others in some way or another. But that's not the way they set that aside and they just say, well, as long as you smoking dope doesn't kill somebody else, then you go smoke dope. And that's the way, and it says if you want that pleasure, then you go for it. Hinduism just says go for it with all you got, and then Hinduism just sits back and waits for you to find out that that's really not what you really wanted anyway. And maybe you don't find that out in this lifetime. But they don't care. You got a million more to follow, and sooner or later you'll find out that's really not what you really wanted. Secondly, on this path of desire is the desire or the want of success, which would be money, fame, and power being the biggest one of those three. Money, fame, and power. Now, success is not bad. It's much more satisfying than pleasure. It doesn't give you hangovers. You don't get pregnant. There's just all kinds of things that you can get from success that doesn't have all the negative side effects of chasing after pleasure. You get dignity and self-respect and so on. But it still falls short primarily because of some of the problems with it. For example, there's no way I can share any of my success without depleting my resources. If I go out and earn $1 million and decide I want to share it with Judy, and so I give her $500,000, then I no longer have $1 million. So I no longer have what I attained. If I am ruler of the Western Hemisphere and decide that I'm going to give this South America to Margaret, then I'm no longer ruler of this Western Hemisphere. So there's no way I can share my power without depleting my resources. And so therefore it becomes very self-serving and competitive. Because the only way I can really succeed is to have it all to myself, and I can never share it. So it's always, leaving somebody behind. And